Great. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming out this evening. This is the fourth and final installment in our series on happiness and well-being. And so I want to thank you all for coming to this one, but also to all of you who came to all of them to make them a really great success. Obviously, you'll be unsurprised to find that I think among the tools we have as human beings to use to produce our own mental hygiene, philosophy is high up on that list. So it's my distinguished pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. I'm Anthony Skelton. I teach philosophy at Western, where I specialize in, among other things, ethics and also philosophy of well-being. This evening's speaker is Erik Angner. Erik is a professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University. He has not one, but two PhDs, one in philosophy and one in economics, both of which are from the University of Pittsburgh. He specializes in moral philosophy, but probably more like what the 19th century philosophers would call moral sciences. And he engages in particular with topics of well-being, rationality, and social order. And his mission is to work out theories and views on those matters in light of the most relevant and recent science on those topics. He is the author of many fine papers in many great journals, and also of 4 books, including Hayek and Natural Law, and of course in Behavioral Economics, which is in its 2nd edition. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about philosophy and the science of happiness. And before you clap, I want to make one more plug for philosophy. On the 14th of March, we have an event over on the other side, 7 p.m. Lisa Feldman-Barrett, Emotions, Facts versus Fictions. And now all my announcements done, please join me in welcoming Professor.
Well, thank you, Anthony, so much for that kind invitation, and thank you to everyone for showing up like this on a school night to hear me talk about this. If you're a professional philosopher, you're used to an audience of like 3, and so it's very encouraging to see so many. Thank you. Before I say too much, I want to invite you to take a moment to take a little survey. If you have a device with you and care to do this, you can pull it out and type these words in there, and you'll find a brief survey about your happiness. This is entirely educational. I don't gather any data. I don't intend to save anything. There are no IP addresses or anything logged. And I'll report the results in a bit, but they'll be aggregate results, and so it won't be possible to figure out what any one individual responded. So I'll give you just a moment to look this up if you're interested, and then you can finish while I'm speaking. So if you have trouble making out the text in the back, it's survey.su.se/London. You can definitely overthink questions like these. I want you to not overthink. Just answer whatever comes first. All right, I'll start speaking, but feel free to finish this while you're listening. So I want to take you on something of a whirlwind tour of the philosophy and science of happiness and talk a bit about what we can learn from an interdisciplinary reflection. But because I'm a philosopher first and an economist second, I want to start off where you expect me to start off with the old Greeks. So there's something called Socrates Question that's often presented as like something of a defining question of the Western philosophical tradition. The question is, how should I live? So it's a question that we associate with Socrates as he appears in the writings, especially, of course, of Plato. And it's seen as a central question in the Western philosophical tradition. Now, there are two ways really to interpret this question. One is as follows, like, how do I live a life that's morally acceptable or admirable? So this is a question about morality. How should I relate to other people? How should I behave? What sort of duties do I have to my fellow human beings, and so on? But then there's another question, or another way in which we can understand this question also, and it's like this. How do I live a life that's good for me? Here the question is not so much what are my duties and responsibilities relative to other people, but what makes for a life that's good for me? Under what circumstances do I live a life that's good and worthwhile, and so on, abstracting away from the impact that my actions might have on other people. And it's that question that I want to focus on tonight, the second question. This is the question of well-being, as professional philosophers like to say. So well-being then is one of the constant themes in the Western philosophical tradition, but it's not a term or an idea that's owned by philosophers alone. Words like well-being and welfare, which is often used synonymously, appear quite across the social and medical sciences. So in economics, psychiatry, epidemiology, gerontology, and so on, questions of well-being are absolutely central. Now, it's widely understood, or widely thought anyway, in the sciences that in order to do science of something, you have to have a measure of it. Like, you can't do science if you can't measure the thing you want to do a science of, if you can't relate it to something like a yardstick, literally or metaphorically. And in the last 100 years or something, when people talk about measuring welfare, well-being, by and large, it's the economists who've dominated the conversation. So there's this long tradition in economics of trying to measure, especially national well-being. So you're familiar with discussion about GDP and so on, right, as a measure of a nation's well-being. Economic growth, of course, is a big concern. Growth is the rate of change in GDP. Growth rates is like you get the idea. All of this relates to GDP, and the reason why economists care about GDP is that it's thought to reflect the well-being or welfare of the nation. Now, that whole tradition, which is very strong, has also generated something of a counter-reaction. So here's a piece of art that I'm particularly fond of. This is a collage from the mid-50s called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? And it's a collage of all sorts of fancy things that one might desire. And of course, you might look at this and think of this environment as sort of vulgar. And I guess that's the idea. If that's your reaction, of course, that marks you as a member of a certain social class. I once gave a presentation on happiness, much like this one, in Alabama's maximum security facility, and to the men in the lifers there, this looked like a pretty good world. So anyway, so there's this reaction, right, to the focus on GDP and economic growth and so on, and it's seen as deeply unsatisfactory if you're interested in well-being. If you're genuinely interested in making people's lives better, and if you're genuinely interested in making the society better, then it seems like we can't just look at the production of goods and services. We can't just look at how much stuff there is to go around, because that seems to miss something important, right? And that seems right. Now, there's this idea of happiness. That goes back also a very long time in our philosophical tradition. It's a central theme in philosophy, of course. It's also something that psychologists have been interested in. And it's something that pops up perhaps in unexpected places, like the US Declaration of Independence. The fact that there is such a lot of interest in happiness these days among psychologists and others is in large part due to the dissatisfaction with the economists' work. So what happened, I think, historically was that people looked at the economists and they said, this is deeply unsatisfactory. What we have to do is to figure out a way to study and to measure the thing that really matters. And when you ask, what is the thing that really matters, to many people it comes naturally to say, well, happiness is it, right? So if we're interested in well-being, what we need to do is to measure happiness directly. And that's what happened. So now people talk about subjective measures of well-being or measures of subjective well-being. But basically what these words denote is like an effort to measure happiness as the sort of thing that really matters if you're interested in well-being and such. Now, the first question many people have about happiness measurement and the science of happiness is, how do you do that? Like, how are you supposed to measure something as ephemeral as happiness? And people are often surprised when they learn how straightforward it is, or how straightforwardly people measure it. So the way people measure happiness levels is often just by asking people straightforward questions like, how happy would you say that you are these days? This particular question has been in use since the 50s. People are given 3 options, not very good, pretty good, or very good, or something, and you get to pick one of the 3. Then you get a number assigned to you based on which one of the categories you selected, and that number gets to represent your happiness. So 1, 2, 3. If you're interested in the well-being of a group, the way people go about it normally is that they ask the group, and then they take an average of the numbers. So if you're interested in the well-being of the unemployed or unwed mothers or something, you sample them, you average the numbers, and that gives you a figure. Sometimes they're based on more elaborate instruments. And going back in history, it's really a fascinating history here. There's an effort to use graphical devices of this kind. So here's something called a faces scale that's often seen as a way to measure satisfaction more than happiness, but nonetheless, the question here reads, which face comes closest to expressing how you feel about your life as a whole? And the idea is that you identify with one of these faces, you indicate somehow like which face it is, then you get a number again on a scale, in this case from 1 to 7, based on like how happy the face was, and that number gets to represent your satisfaction or your happiness. You might recognize these sorts of images. They're increasingly common now in like the checkout counters and in airports and so on. Like you get to indicate how satisfied you are with security control on the way out. Have you seen this? So they have these large devices with big buttons, and you can smack them on your way out, and it's a way to give feedback to the organization. They're also used in psychiatry and elsewhere with patients who are unable to speak. They're used in some cases during childbirth when the person giving birth is unable to speak. She might still be able to point to one of these faces to indicate, the level of pain that she's experiencing. You're laughing, but this is very serious science. These questions might be familiar if you took the survey just a moment ago. This is from a scale that was developed in the late 90s that's very widely used, and which I use myself in some empirical work that I'll talk about shortly. Here the questions just read, so in general, I consider myself not a very happy person or a very happy person, and you get to pick a number between those 2 extremes that represents your happiness. All right, you want to see how you scored? This is technology dependent, so it may or may not work, but here we go. All right, so here's your happiness. So here we're pretty tightly clustered in the middle of the scale. This is impossible to see from the back there, but nobody scored in the top range from between 6 and 7, and nobody scored in the bottom range between 1 and 2. People find themselves roughly in the middle of the scale. I don't know if this is surprising at all, but this is roughly how the numbers cluster. Oftentimes, they're a little higher than this, but they vary quite a bit from one population to another. So this is how it's done. Like sometimes people say, isn't it really hard to measure well-being or whatever? And the fact is that the way people do it, it's actually really easy to measure, or happiness, I should say. It's really easy to measure happiness. This is how you do it. Now, if you read the contemporary scientists, you might get the impression that this is a new enterprise, that it's something that happened like in the last 20 years or something. But if you look at the history, there's an unbroken history going back at least a century of people doing this. So there's a very rich and interesting effort that started off like in the 20s or before, right after World War I. And so here I want to show you just as an example of what people were doing. This is from one of my favorite papers of all time from 1930. Professor of 1930, professor of education at Columbia noted in a paper that everybody talks about the importance of education to happiness and how the goal of education is to make happy people. And he said, but nobody has tried to measure whether education makes anyone happier. And so he decided to try to figure out a way to measure it. He did a whole bunch of stuff that's interesting to talk about, but here's just something that I particularly like. Here he had a number of different vignettes that he presented for people. The vignettes read like this, like finding life rather disappointing and disillusioning, comfortable in many ways, moderately successful, but far from realizing the hopes of youth. Or ups and downs, now happy about things, now depressed, about balance in the long run. Or my absolute favorite, life often seems so worthless that there's little to keep one going. Nothing matters very much. There's been so much hurt that laughter would be empty mockery. Okay. So you pick one of these vignettes, and then he had an independent group of psychiatrists rank them in order of happiness, assigned numbers to them accordingly, and then assign numbers to the individuals based on which vignette they picked. Here's a panel from another of my favorite contributions. This is from a Duke sociologist called Hornell Hart, who was impressed by epidemiology. So he said that epidemiology has done wonders for human bodily health, and what he wanted to do, Hart, was to do the same for mental health that epidemiology had done for bodily health. But he said that in epidemiology, there's a thermometer that you could use to measure temperature and get a gauge of health, whereas we don't have the same thing in the case of mental health. And so he set out to design something he called a euphorimeter, which would be a happiness measurement device that measures happiness in euphor units. And one of the things that he did for the first time, as far as I've been able to tell, was to track people over time. So here he recruited a bunch of his students, all undergraduates, all males, for a few months in the spring, and he published these little graphs. So here, for example, we have a fellow who was bumbling along just fine here for a while, between 200 and 300 euphor units. Then here he's greatly attracted by a girl, and this is a disaster because he's not sure that he can date her. But then he does get a date, and so his happiness goes all the way up here, and then there's some predictable drama. And he also published corresponding graphs for a man whose mother died unexpectedly, where you see a sharp drop in happiness following the event, or right before or after she got sick. He has another graph of a man who starts off saying he's so unhappy, he doesn't understand why everyone doesn't just kill themselves. But the man realized over the course of the studies that not everyone was as unhappy as he was, and that he didn't need to be that unhappy. And what you see over time is that the scores climbed a little bit. To Hart, this is really encouraging. One, because it shows that the scores vary roughly the way you would expect if they're correct, right? But also that by virtue of doing this sort of study, by virtue of participating in this sort of work, you might actually lift yourself out of the depth of despair. Here's another panel that many of you might have come across. This is from a more recent paper by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and a co-author published in the journal Pain. Here they had patients undergoing colonoscopies, which are, of course, experienced as humiliating and painful procedures. And they had patients who were awake for the procedure, and they were invited to hold their hand on a little dial that they could rotate with a little arrow ranging from 0 to 10 that was supposed to represent the level of pain that they were in. And so over the course of the procedure, then patients would rotate this dial, and Kahneman and his co-author Riddlemeyer got to draw these little graphs representing the amount of pain that the period experienced over this period. So this is pain, not happiness, but you can think of these curves as upside down. And what they were saying was that the area under the curve here is the total amount of pain experienced during the episode. Now they somehow managed to get ethics approval to impose additional pain on patients, to impose a little tail over here to taper it out. And the finding was that people remember the experience as less painful if you have a little episode like this. And so if you want to remember your visit to the dentist more fondly, you could ask them to keep drilling for a while after they're done while tapering out the level of pain. You know, it's a tip, it's science. So this is the stuff that people do. This is endlessly fascinating. But I want to talk also about what these researchers think we should do with these numbers. So once you have all these numbers, what do you do with them? And one thing that stands out when you read the literature is that people are extraordinarily optimistic. So here are two of the leading lights of this movement, Ed Diener and Marty Seligman, who wrote in 2004, that our thesis is that subjective well-being, being the sort of thing you measure with these devices, should become a primary focus of policymakers, and that its rigorous measurement is a primary policy imperative. We propose that well-being, as they define it again, ought to be the ultimate goal around which economic, health, and social policies are built. So the implicit contrast here is with economic welfare measurement, right? So in the past, there's a perception that we designed all of our policies so as to maximize GDP or something similar. And what they're saying here is that they reject that picture. And they say instead of maximizing GDP and producing as many goods and services as we can, whatever, what we ought to do is to maximize the numbers of these measures. So it's an extremely ambitious proposal, right? Saying that we should abandon these other things and we should use this as the benchmark for social policies. There are, in fact, some countries who have tried to implement this, although perhaps in a smaller scale, which is interesting. It hasn't happened in Canada. It hasn't happened in the States. Some countries have started adopting these numbers as a complement to traditional economic accounts, but basically this has been the ambition for a long time. All right, so it's a very ambitious proposal underlying this. All right, what have we learned? So using these measures, we can study like who's happy. We can also figure out what's associated with happiness, what the preconditions for happiness are. So what have we learned? Well, now I want to just show you some of the things I think we have learned. And of course, I'm going to give you an extremely superficial sort of survey of the field. Much of this is going to be stronger than it should be. Nothing is final, right? This is a fairly young research project after all. Like some of these findings may come to be overturned, but the things I'll talk about are findings I think of as pretty robust, and the general conclusions will hold even if like the details turn out to be a little wrong. Okay, so for all we know, based on like current happiness studies, here are some things that might not surprise you. So gender does not seem to matter very much. People who identify as men and people who identify as women are roughly equally happy. Race and ethnicity doesn't matter much once you control for income and education and so on. Poverty is bad. Being poor is very bad for happiness. Unemployment is bad. It's bad even if you control for poverty. So being unemployed reduces your happiness more than just being poor, even if you're poor as a result of being unemployed. Feeling unhealthy is bad. Being religious is good. This is an interesting one because there are a number of thinkers, conservative thinkers, who think of this as sort of proving what conservatives have said all along, namely that you should be married and so on. But it's also consistent, actually, with what Marx was saying about religion being the opium of the people. Right? What he was getting at was that it's something that consoles you or something that gives you consolation under difficult conditions. Being religious is good, so religious people are happier than atheists. This could be because people who are religious tend to have larger social networks and more social interaction, which is good. Having friends is good. Happy friends are best. So there are some network studies that suggest that when you become happier, if you become happier as a result of some incidental sort of random event, it has an effect on your friends and your friends' friends and your friends' friends' friends. So happiness is contagious in the way similar to the way in which medical conditions might be contagious. So far so good, right? There's nothing here that's like really surprising, and in a way this is maybe desirable. If the conclusions were completely wildly unexpected, then we would suspect that maybe these measures aren't really getting at anything. But then there are some other findings that are like a little more puzzling, and I want to talk about 3 or so of those. So here's happiness and money. So this is impossible to read, but basically each dot in this graph represents a country. Down here we have GDP per capita, so this is how rich the country is in some sense, and this is a happiness score on a 0 to 100 scale. You notice a couple of different things that sort of stand out. One is that happiness is increasing in money, right? So the richer the country by and large, the happier it is. The increase seems to decline. So economists like to talk about diminishing marginal utility of money and so on. And here there's a similar effect where if you move from this end of the scale to this end of the scale, you can expect a radical increase in happiness. But if you move from here to here, the effect is going to be much smaller, right? So the effect of money seems to decline as you become richer. Another thing that's interesting is that if you look at the rich countries up here, they're basically all pretty happy, right? There's no rich country that's desperately unhappy. But if you look over here, there's a lot more variation. So among the poor countries, there are some that are really terrible, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. And then there are some up here that are really quite happy, so Philippines, Brazil, Colombia, whatever. So there's more variation among the poor countries than there is among the rich ones. Okay? Here's happiness by family income. So if you look at annual income, this is in US dollars, ranging from 10,000 to 160,000 on a logarithmic scale. And here's a fraction of the population that's experiencing various kinds of feeling. There's this line here that keeps increasing. That's a satisfaction scale. If you look at positive affect, which is roughly the same thing as happiness, like how happy you feel, how cheerful you are, what you notice is that it goes up at the bottom of the scale, but then hitting like 70,000 or something, it's basically flat. There's effectively like no difference between the comfortably well-off and the rich. All right. What's the explanation for this? Well, there are probably a couple of different factors. One is that you adapt to having money. You get a bigger house and so on. You think it's going to make you happier. It makes you happier for a little while. But once you get used to having the bigger house, you're bothered by how long time it takes to vacuum it and so on. Some of it may have to do with social comparisons. So one reason why people want bigger homes and fancier cars and so on is to beat out the neighbors, right, to keep up with the Joneses. But then when the Joneses think in the same way, everyone's working harder to get a bigger car and nobody's gaining in relative terms. And then there's this phenomenon of rising aspiration levels where when you're poor, you aspire to a certain level of income. Maybe you want to be middle class, but when you're middle class, all of a sudden you're not satisfied with being middle class anymore. You want to be upper middle class, and then by virtue of like raising your standards, you can't quite keep up, right? And that generates an effect where you run faster and faster, but you're not really getting anywhere. So those are some of the explanations for these sorts of effects. There's a cartoon I like where two men are playing golf, and the one says, "Researchers say I'm not happier for being richer, but do you know how much researchers make?" Which is roughly accurate, I guess. Sour grapes or something. All right. Health is something I mentioned in passing, but I want to talk a little more about it. So there's a whole industry based on the notion that being healthy makes you happy, right? A huge industry involving like very expensive clothes and so on, activities of various kinds, destination trips, for this and that. Where the assumption is that if only I could be a little healthier, surely I would be happier. Okay. This is true if you look at people's perceptions of their own health, but it turns out to depend on how you think about health, how you measure it. Here's from a study I did with some colleagues in the medical school, where we asked people who had multiple health conditions about their health and their happiness. Here is happiness by subjective health. What you have on the bottom here is the self-reported health from poor through fair, good, very good to excellent. And what you have here is a happiness score on a 7-point scale where we use the same questionnaire that you did earlier today. These boxes here contain a lot of information that you can safely ignore. The most important thing is this line in the middle here, in the middle of the box. That's the median happiness. So that's the happiness of the person in the middle of the distribution. If you line them up from unhappy to happy, the person in the middle has that much happiness. And what you notice here is that happiness goes up when health becomes better, right? Healthier people are happier than unhealthy people, which is what you'd expect. You're also seeing this diminishing marginal effect sort of thing, where going from poor to fair health comes with a fairly large jump in happiness, whereas here the difference is much smaller, and here there is no difference at all. Again, you notice that the people up here the people who are very healthy, they're roughly the same with respect to happiness. They're all pretty happy, right? There's nobody almost down here whose health is good, but who's nonetheless unhappy. By contrast, over here, among the unhappy, there are people along the entire scale. So there are some people who are in poor health and who have very low happiness, but there are also some people who are super resilient, who are in poor health, but who nonetheless are happy, which is an interesting phenomenon, right? It means that a happiness is not completely determined by your health level, right? There are ways to be happy, even if you're unhealthy, which could be a source of consolation, perhaps. But this is subjective health, as they say in medicine, so the person's own perception of how healthy she is. Another way to think of health is in terms of objective standards. So what we did is that we asked the same questions of the same people, but we also asked them how many medical diagnoses they have or have had. So we gave them a list of 12 different conditions, and we asked them, have you ever been diagnosed with this? Have you ever been diagnosed with this? And so on. And then we constructed a measure based on the number of affirmative responses to these questions. So people who've never had any of the diagnoses would have a 0, and people who had all 12 would have a 12. Right? So that's a sort of objective measure of health. And the same graph using an objective measure of health rather than a subjective measure of health looks like this. There's absolutely no relationship between health down here, from better health to worse health, and happiness here. Right? What you see is that these lines are roughly the same. They vary randomly. Over here, it looks as though they start to decline, but there are very few people with 7, 8, and 9 of these conditions, right? And then there's this one guy up here who has 9 of these conditions and whose happiness score is virtually perfect. So this is somebody who had diabetes and a heart condition and a kidney condition and cancer and a couple of other things, like 7 or 9 of these things, and who nonetheless says that he's effectively perfectly happy. This is puzzling. It's puzzling to many contemporaries. Somebody it was not puzzling to, or would not have been puzzling to, was Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, has this book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is really much better than the other one that people know of, The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about a man who loses a leg and gets a wooden leg. And Adam Smith writes that in the beginning, the man cries like a baby. He thinks his life will never be the same. He'll never be able to enjoy himself again. But then as time passes, he realizes that many of the things that gave him joy and pleasure before he lost his leg are still available to him. There are many pleasures, many things you can do, even if you don't have a leg. And so although it's terrible to lose a leg, over time you adapt and your happiness rebounds. Even if it doesn't go back to where it was before, at least it's going to be a lot better after a while. So that's what people now call the process of adaptation. And it seems to be a big part of the story here, where getting a medical diagnosis is bad, the onset of symptoms is very bad from a happiness perspective, but for many, not all, but for many conditions, we learn to adapt over time and we find out ways to live good, enjoyable lives anyway, which is kind of interesting. Another phenomenon, so John Henry is, of course, an African-American folk hero. Many will be familiar with this story because he's been immortalized by everyone from Bruce Springsteen to Walt Disney to the U.S. Postal Service. But roughly, the story is that he's a hero, right? He went up in a competition against a machine building railroads, but he's a tragic figure, he's a tragic hero because although he won, he died in victory. Psychologists and medical doctors now talk about John Henryism as the sort of property of being like John Henry. So you have John Henryism, or you're high in John Henryism if you're like John Henry. You set yourself high goals, you don't give up easily, you keep trucking no matter what happens, and so on. There's a standard scale for John Henryism with 12 different questions that ask questions like that. If something has got to get done right, do you feel like you need to do it yourself? Do you set high goals for yourself? Do you give up easily when you meet resistance, and so on? And so we went to a hospital setting again and asked questions about happiness and John Henryism. And what we found was this. So here's John Henryism at the bottom, from low to high. And here's happiness again from 1 to 7. over here, we have the people we affectionately call the couch potatoes. These are people who never set goals for themselves, who give up immediately if they meet resistance, who are happy to let other people take care of everything and so on. And in terms of happiness, they're super happy, right? They're way up here. Over here are the John Henrys, the people who set themselves very high goals, who don't give up, right? Who persist, and so on. And they're miserable on the average, right? They're extremely unhappy. This is one of the strongest sort of effects that I've seen. And so this is interesting. Like we often teach our children to try harder and so on, right? But if we really wanted them to be happy, we would teach them to be couch potatoes, because boom, right? Yeah, that's interesting. So last phenomenon, kids. So if you ask people who have kids if their kids make them happier, like everyone says yes, right? You'd sound like a sort of monster if you didn't. In fact, some of you may remember there was a sort of scandal, I guess, a few years ago, where an author in California wrote an article where she effectively said that she didn't like her kids all that much. What she was saying was that, you know, if her kids died, she'd be able to bounce back, but if her husband died, she wouldn't. And the reaction was fierce, right? She was treated like a very bad person for having said something like this. But if you look at the happiness data, what the evidence suggests is, first, that people with kids are less happy than people without kids. And also that people are less happy when they're spending time with their kids than when they're doing many other things. So the table over on the right there is from a particularly famous study also by Kahneman, who I mentioned earlier, where they sampled housewives in Texas, in a big city, about how they spent their time. Now, you can't just ask, like, do your kids make you happy? Because everyone will say, yes, of course. So what they did was they asked people, like, yesterday, between 1 and 2, what were you doing? And people will say, I did this and that. And then the next question is, and how happy were you at the time? And when people respond to those sorts of questions, you get very different answers. So here are activities ordered from happier to less happy. Okay, so at the very top is intimate relations. So sex. Sex is good. Right? Thank you, science, for informing us of this. But then you have socializing after work, dinner, relaxing, lunch, exercising, praying, socializing at work, watching television, foam at home, napping, cooking, shopping. Notice what does not appear in this list. Shopping, computer at home, housework. That's like doing laundry and ironing and stuff. And then, boom, childcare, right above the evening commute, working, and the morning commute. Which suggests that people are really not very happy when they have to spend time with their kids. Now, I should say that there are lots of things going on here, right? So this is a very special sample. There's evidence that suggests that these numbers look very different in different countries. And so there's some chance that these numbers just tap into like the thoroughly alienating experience of being a housewife in Texas. But nonetheless, right, it's interesting to look at these numbers because they just don't match what our culture tells us they ought to be, right? I think you'll agree with that. And maybe I'll confess that I'm speaking as somebody. I have 3 kids and I love them to pieces, but somehow I'm not that surprised about these numbers, to be honest. Because when you have, especially when they're small, right, you sleep very little. Everything else that previously gave your life meaning, right, all the hobbies and all the social relations and everything else you do, you have to cut back basically on everything. And so you're giving up a lot in order to spend time with your kids. And even if it's wonderful, of course, there'll be some loss in happiness due to like all the other things you don't do, like, yeah, the other things you don't do. All right, so here's childcare. Okay, now, what does this mean? Supposing all of this will hold up, and that's a big but, right? So I'll say again that I'm giving you like a very brief cursory overview of the field, but let's just suppose that these results hold up, or that most of them do. It seems as though we must say that the affluent are not much better off than the merely non-poor, right? There's no benefit to being upper middle class relative to middle class, or being rich relative to being middle class. It sounds as though parents and active copers are worse off, right? That parents are doing worse, and people who have like goals in life and things are worse off. It also seems that people with most medical conditions are no worse off, that it's not a bad thing for you to lose a leg or have cancer or something. And that doesn't sound that doesn't sound quite right. Think about the policy implications. If we took Diener and Seligman seriously and we decided to abandon the goal of like promoting economic growth, and instead we decided to just like maximize these numbers, what sort of policies would we end up promoting? Well, we'd discourage people from having kids, right? Or as it might seem, we should teach our kids at home and in schools not to like set goals, sort of try to accomplish anything, right? Because they're just going to be unhappy. We should stop worrying about people who are sick and, you know, traffic accidents and things like that. And think about raising kids. You know, how bizarre it would be to try to raise kids that do this. And so clearly, this is not the conclusion we want to draw, right? Is it a conclusion we have to draw? Well, it really isn't, and that's what I'm gonna try to tell you next. Because of this, I think we should ask, like, what is well-being? So we're ultimately, if you recall, interested in questions of well-being, like who's well off and who isn't. And it's worth stopping up for a second and asking, like, what is well-being? What are we after? Like, what is that thing that we want in our own lives and in the lives of those we care about? And what is that thing that we design policy to maximize and so on? When you read the contemporary happiness scientists, very often they identify well-being and happiness. So they think of the happy person as the person who has well-being and the well-off person as the person who's happy. So well-being in this view is constituted by happiness. So they write things like, well-being can be defined by people's conscious experiences in terms of hedonic feelings or cognitive satisfactions, or happiness is the ultimate currency, the end toward which all other ends lead, and should be the determinant of our actions, the goal toward which all other goals lead. So effectively what they're saying is that happiness and well-being are one and the same. That's the thing that counts. That's the thing you should aim for, and so on. And if you take that view, then the conclusions on the previous slide pretty much hold, right? Then you're forced to accept that if these results hold up, those are the policy implications, right? Shouldn't set goals for ourselves or whatever. The way philosophers put this is in terms of accounts of well-being. So an account of well-being is a story about what well-being is. The conditions that tell you an answer to the question, what does it mean to be well off? And the way a philosopher would say this is that the scientists here presuppose a mental state account of well-being, which is an account according to which well-being is a mental state of some kind, happiness or satisfaction. A mental state being something that happens like in your head, as it were, that you could feel or sense or whatever. If you adopt those accounts, they are in fact associated with all these awkward consequences. But what's interesting about this is that given how common these views are among scientists of well-being, they're fantastically rare among philosophers of well-being. So philosophers have been at it for 2,500 years, right? And there was a period when these views were real big, like 200 years ago during the era of classical utilitarianism or whatnot. But these days, or over the last 100 years or something, these views are extremely rare. I mean, there's no philosophical view so absurd you can't find like some philosopher who'll defend it, right? But for a philosophical view, it's remarkable how unanimous philosophers are in rejecting this idea that well-being and happiness are one and the same. That is the idea that seems to be sort of one of the defining features of the whole science of happiness. Now, philosophers have made the case traditionally, not so much on the basis of empirical results. They've made it on the basis of thought experiences, experiments. So here's the thought experiments of the experience machine, which many of you have read about on your device. I should say right away that obviously this machine, the picture does not depict an actual experience machine, right? But the idea is that an experience machine can give you any experience you want. So you could plug in and you can have whatever feeling you want. It could be feelings of pleasure, but it doesn't have to be. It could be the feeling of writing a novel and becoming a celebrated author, or like dating your favorite movie star, or whatever you can concoct, right? You can have that experience inside of this machine. And the question is, would you sign up? And when you ask people, sometimes they say, few people say they will, but very often people say they won't. And now we can see where you guys fall on this, because I have the data right here, I think. There were 54 of you who answered, And here are the results. So 12 or 13 or 14 or something of you said that you would plug in, but a pretty large majority of 40 people said that they wouldn't. This is, incidentally, not that different from what the lifers in Alabama's maximum security facilities said. Isn't that interesting? So here, I'll tell you that like the penal system in Alabama is not like among the world's most liberal, and so it's quite clear that these men are not living lives that are very satisfying by human standards. But given the choice to like plug into this experience machine and living a copy of your life or any other life, they chose to live the life they're actually living in prison rather than the simulated version of their life that they could have in the experience machine. And so what this shows is that for very many people, living this kind of life is not what we want, right? That's not seen as a good life for us. That's not the sort of life we want to lead. And what that suggests to the philosopher is that maybe there's something else that counts above and beyond the mental state that you're in. You see how the argument goes? Right? If you're not willing to plug in, that must mean that there's something that you care about for you that isn't the experiences, right? Because all the experiences, you could have those in the machine. If you don't want that, then there's got to be something else that you care about other than happiness. And then we can ask, what is that thing? And what is that thing? Well, there are some thoughts out there. Philosophers have had some thoughts about this. Here's one kind of thought. This is an ad I came across in an airport in North Carolina. It's for one of the local campuses there. It says, come here to this university to become the person you want to be, even if you don't know who that is yet. And I think this is interesting. Right? What it doesn't say is, come here to be happy. And that was Watson's idea, right? Education is to make people happy. This is not what this ad says. And for good reason. Students in general are not that happy. The first time I distributed happiness questionnaires among my students, this was in an honors college. Very talented students, like super sociable, really, really bright futures ahead of them and so on. And they were really quite miserable. I went back to the numbers and confirmed that this was right and whatever. And this turns out to be a phenomenon. Like students are not that happy. And it's interesting because many people during their adult lives will tell you that the college years were the best years of their life. But that's probably not true because students aren't that happy. In particular, my college students in the honors college on my campus were less happy than the lifers at the maximum security facility down the road, right? So that they have good reason not to advertise the college education as something that's going to make you happier, at least not in the short run. And the reason why this is interesting and sort of philosophically suggestive is that one of the accounts that do have lots of followers among contemporary philosophers is a view that says that what matters, if you're interested in well-being, is the degree to which your desires are fulfilled or your preferences are satisfied. Okay? So in the lingo favored by philosophers, then we'll say that there's another account of well-being. There's another story about what well-being is that we'll call a preference satisfaction account or a desire fulfillment account, which says that what matters is the extent to which your preferences are satisfied. That is, the extent to which you get what you want. This view has been quite popular among philosophers over the course of the last 100 years. It's also become, and it still is, the mainstream view among economists. So if you've ever studied economics, if you know your microtheory, the story about utility and so on, is all based on preferences. The concept of utility is defined in terms of preferences, which means that in economic theory, you're well off to the extent that your preferences are satisfied. This is the view that they're defending implicitly. Now, of course, there are many wrinkles to this story. Very often philosophers will say that the preferences that matter are not the preferences that you actually have, but the preferences that you would have if you were like ideally informed and perfectly rational and so on. And so that's a complication. But the basic idea is that what matters here is not how happy you are, but rather whether you get what you want. And those are not the same thing, right? It's possible to get what you want and remain unhappy. It's also possible to be happy in spite of not getting what you want. So there's a line from George Bernard Shaw saying there are two tragedies in life. Like one is not getting your heart's desire, the other is getting your heart's desire, something like that. so having your preferences satisfied and being happy are two very different things, and they don't always come together. So this is one alternative view. And then here, there's another view that's also been really popular in the last few generations. What you have on the left here is an image from the Human Development Index put out by the United Nations. So this is an index that's supposed to serve as an alternative to GDP numbers for comparing development across countries. If you're interested in which country has developed more or how development has changed over time, whatever, the Human Development Index is supposed to give you an answer to that question. And the way they do it is that they look at a number of different things. They look at whether people live long and healthy lives. They look at whether people have access to knowledge, if they get an education and so on. And then they look at whether they get a decent standard of living. This general approach is based on some philosophical work in a tradition that goes back to Aristotle, actually, where the basic thought is that there are some things that are good for a human being, independently of whether the person wants those things and independently of whether those things make the person any happier. Many people will know this under the term the capability approach, which is associated with some philosophers, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, above all. And the idea here is that there are some things that count. It doesn't matter if those things make you any happier. It doesn't matter if those are things that you want. There's some things that count anyway, maybe by virtue of us being human. Maybe there's something about being human that means that there are certain conditions under which we flourish. There are certain things such that when we have those things, we live better lives than when we don't. Philosophers talk about these as objective list accounts, where the idea is that there is, in some sense, an objective list, a list that's independent of our beliefs and desires, of things that are good or bad for us. Now, obviously, philosophers disagree about what those things are exactly, but there's some things that tend to come back, and it's things like health, for example. So the idea here is that being healthy is good for you, even if it doesn't make you any happier, even if you don't, for whatever reason, want to be healthy, it's still good for you to be healthy. Rational activity can be seen as a sort of thing that is quintessentially human. It's a capacity we have to be rational, and to the extent that we have the ability to be rational and develop our abilities, and to the extent that we exercise those abilities, we lead better lives, even if it doesn't make us any happier, and even if we don't want to, and so on. So building a family, having friends, exercising your other abilities, and so on, might be on this list. So this is the view that's sort of underlying the Human Development Index and a lot of contemporary philosophers. All right, so here are three alternative views of what well-being is in broad outline. The first one seems to be more or less universally adopted by at least many of the contributors to the science of happiness. The other two tend to be popular among philosophers. There's a very interesting disconnect between the way philosophers and scientists think about the nature of well-being. So wrapping up, what do we learn from this? Well, there are many things that remain to be said, obviously, right? We could talk about this for the rest of our lives, which would not be a bad thing, I guess. But even at this level of abstraction, we can draw some conclusions. One thing we can say, I think, is that the science of happiness has some good things going for it, right? It's generated some stimulating, potentially instructive findings. There's some insights here that might actually help us lead better lives. There's some insights that might give us some comfort, right? Many of us fear ill health and so on. It might be interesting to learn that the evidence suggests that we can be happy anyway. But that said, this underlying idea, this underlying philosophical doctrine that says that what well-being is happiness, is something we should probably abandon, right? I'm not suggesting we solve these questions by taking a vote among philosophers or something, but there are really lots of reasons not to think of well-being in terms of happiness. And if that's true, then there's no essential connection at all between happiness and well-being. It could still be, on the other views, that there are some contingent connections, but there's no conceptual necessary connection between these two ideas. Moreover, this sort of reflection suggests that happiness is not as important as people think. That if you read the popular press or glossy magazines or whatever, you might think that happiness is the only thing, right? If you read the positive psychologists, the people who do the science of happiness, you might similarly get the idea that happiness is the only thing that counts. But there's lots of conditions under which people are not very happy, but can nonetheless be described as doing well. So people who want to have kids, for example, and who have kids can legitimately be described as thereby having been made better off, even if they're miserable because their kids are keeping them up at night or whatever, right? And people who want to live a life of active engagement with the world, people who set goals for themselves and try to execute those goals and try to reach it, do things. If that's what you want, right, and you're doing that, then it seems like we should be able to say that they're living good lives for a human being, even if they're unhappy as a result of not being as good as they want to be or something. Moreover, and here's the final punchline, like until the philosophical issues get sorted, or until we get a little more clarity on like what the correct account of well-being is, the policy implications of this remain very much open for debate, right? It's just not clear what this science means for policy. And by that I mean both like public policy, as in government policy, but also personal policy, like how we should lead our lives. And what this means is that philosophy matters. Like how we think about philosophy, what theory of well-being we adopt, and how we reflect on this, and how we weigh advantages and disadvantages and so on, is important. And what that suggests is that the sort of conversation that we're having here tonight, and that you've had, those of you who've attended the other lectures in this series, is absolutely critical if you want to figure out what the science has to say about how we are to live a good life in our personal lives and how we are to build a better society. Thank you very much. What's the tradition? Why don't you field the questions?
I just wonder, like, who makes this list? Who makes the list that decides what well-being is? That's the issue. Anthony had a good comment a couple of weeks ago where the list is good, throwing a little happiness in on top of it to make it count, I guess.
Yeah, so the people think differently about this, but the basic idea is that the list is somehow given. It's determined by human nature or something like that. And so our job is to figure out what those things are. We're not in charge of like saying what they are. We figure out what they are. Happiness could be one of these things, right? It's possible to integrate these ideas by saying that what makes for a life worth living is like having a healthy life and having a family and having friends and so on, and also being happy, right? So that's one way to integrate these ideas.
Has there been any studies on two things? One, childhood traumas and how they affect your happiness. Because I feel like a lot of your happiness comes from if you had a good childhood, if you had traumas. The other one is how well you know yourself, and how that also comes from your childhood, and if that is true happiness, knowing yourself overall, and then being able to just be happy because you know yourself. And did any of those have to do with this version of happiness?
Maybe. So there are lots of things there. So when it comes to childhood trauma, I should confess right away that I don't know. So everything I've heard about this is like secondhand from researchers I trust. I haven't looked at the actual data, so don't quote me on this. But I mean, my feeling is that one of the upshots of this literature on resilience is that like even quite severe trauma does not necessarily doom a person to a life of unhappiness. So what you saw on some of those other graphs suggests that people who are really healthy and who have been fortunate in those respects tend to be all relatively happy with a small number of exceptions, but people who are less fortunate are all over the scale. And so for some people, the trauma is an antecedent to a lot of pain and suffering. Other people succeed in developing and live good lives anyway. And so in resilience, like one of the big issues is, like, what is it that makes for this difference? Like, what is it that makes some people bounce back so quick and other people not? So those are super interesting questions.
Could it be like trauma that's passed down through generations, and how parents or grandparents have reacted to that, and that we've.
I've heard that theory. I'm not in a position to assess that myself, so I'll just leave it there. But yeah, that's a possibility. Yeah.
So you spoke about more than one time. I read it in the series that well-being somehow is there are two ways kind of philosophers that are defining well-being. One that has to do with fulfillment of desire and wants, and that's one way, and another one that was more like it's well-being, regardless of the fulfillment of the desire, has to do with the person just living a good life. And that's agreed upon. There is a list of these things that makes a good life or what's good for them. But when you separated that from happiness, that leaves happiness as something separate. And you're saying that this is a concern for philosophers all over history. So what is happiness being separate in that case from that? What would that be? What would be the ingredients of that from that philosophical point of view?
So tell me if this addresses your question. If it doesn't, ask again. But so one question that you could have is like, where does this leave happiness, right?
Yeah, what is it?
So suppose you're, you go with a preference satisfaction view or something. That seems to leave happiness completely out of the picture, and that doesn't seem quite right either, right? But there are various ways in which happiness can still matter under that sort of theory. So for example, if you care about feeling good, and well-being is a matter of satisfying your preferences, then feeling good becomes the sort of thing that makes for a better life for you. And so there's an indirect way that happiness and feelings of happiness can matter, even if they don't matter in your philosophical theory, as it were. In this sense, it doesn't really matter how you define happiness. You can define it in lots of different ways. You can think of it as positive feelings. You can think of it as satisfaction. You can think of it as like positive or active engagement with the world or something. If you care about it, if it's something that you want in your life, then having that makes for a better life for you. Do you see what I'm saying? So
in that case is measured by just the personal feeling that the person feels that they have a better life. So that would be more like it.
So I guess the point about happiness is that questions about how you define happiness fade into the background. The thing that matters are the things that you want. If you want to feel good, then that counts because it's something that you want, right? If you want active engagement with the world, then that counts. It doesn't matter so much which one of those things we identify with happiness. If you want it and you have it, then that's good. If you want it and you don't have it, then it's not good.
And that doesn't tie in to well-being?
So well-being is getting your desires fulfilled on that view, or having your preferences satisfied. And so one way to satisfy your preferences might be to want to be happy and to be happy, right? So if that's your story, then that's great. Then you have well-being. So well-being remains front and center in the story, but happiness fades into the background. It's just not very important on that sort of philosophical theory, which is what I was getting at by the end when I said that, happiness doesn't have the importance that many of us imagine. Now, in the Western world. So I realized that there are cultural differences in how we think of happiness and how we value it and so on. That might matter as well. So.
What would you make of the case of happiness as a positional good?
I think there's some suggestion that there's some evidence that it might be a positional good, that you assess your level of happiness by reference to how happy other people are. You sometimes see this mentioned in context of like social media. Like if you look at Instagram or something, everyone is living a wonderful life, right? Everyone looks super good and they're all having dinner in the sunset in Italy and whatever. And it looks as though everyone's like super happy. And then you might introspect and say to yourself, my level of happiness is like not that good, and you might feel bad, and you might say to yourself, I wish I were as happy as all my friends, right? But the fact, of course, is that they're not all that happy. What they post is like a tiny sliver, like a moment's view when everything was good. And so treating happiness as a positional good is something that where it matters, like where you fall in the distribution, might be, or it seems to me anyway, like a great recipe for unhappiness.
That explains very much about my life right now.
All right. I hope it helps. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I mean, I think there's there's some real insights here, I think, that can make a difference. I made a big move in the last couple of years, and I made it basically on the basis of happiness research, and so far so good, I think. I don't want my money back quite yet.
Just wondering, are there any studies that explore your framework of meaning? Like, for example, Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, he was able to withstand the blows of being in a concentration camp, not necessarily happy, but he was able to maintain a sense of well-being. As are people who are quite religious or profoundly religious. It's almost as if the meaning or framework of meaning gives you your own benchmark of expectations of life, and therefore you're not as dissatisfied if you're looking across the fence, you name or whatever, right? So are there any studies that kind of, at least contemporarily, show or demonstrate that having a sense of personal framework of meaning directs your happiness and or
Yes, so there's a lot of interest in meaning, and that's true both among the scientists and among some philosophers. Now, this is not my core area, so I hesitate to say too much. I worry that I'll be making stuff up as I go along. But one context in which this pops up is in the context of kids. So there's some suggestion that although people become less happy after they have children, they experience more meaning in their lives. And so there's a trade-off in a way where you have kids, you experience meaning. Maybe you're miserable because they cried all night and you can't do any of the things you enjoy doing otherwise, but it gives you some sense of meaning to be part of this multi-generational struggle, and to have kids and take care of kids and enter a new role in your life and whatever. There might be lots of things going on that could give you a sense of meaning, even though you're not any happier. And that seems important, right? It seems like something we could also take into account. Again, if your theory of well-being is that what matters is the degree to which your desires are fulfilled, then a desire to feel meaning becomes just as important as a desire to be happy, maybe. And then you need to take both of these things into account. And then all of a sudden having kids look a whole lot better from the point of view of well-being. But yeah, if you're interested in it, I encourage you to look into it because there's a ton of research on it.
I read an economics paper some time ago, and I sort of forget the details of it, but it was a theory paper that was supposing that a utility function is something that has an evolutionary basis. And I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, it wasn't really connected to data, but I was just wondering if you, in this context, if you come across anything.
Yeah. So there's one suggestion that comes back a lot in this literature, which is that it might seem puzzling that people adapt to things and that we don't get happy, right? So in this part of the world, right, we're so rich. Even people who are relatively poor in Canada are enormously rich by historical standards, right? There's never been people in the history of humankind as rich as we are, and yet, right, so many people are so miserable and whatever. And one explanation for that is evolutionary, where the story is that evolution didn't train us to be satisfied with whatever we have, right? Because those of our ancestors who developed in those ways were just sitting around like doing nothing, being satisfied, and they lost out in the competition for survival. And the people who survived were the ones who were like, happy enough not to be, absorbed by depression and so on, but unhappy enough to be motivated to keep trucking. In fact, for Adam Smith, this is the engine of growth. It's the fact that we mispredict how happy we would be if we had more money that makes us work and engage in industry and become rich and so on. And that's what drives economic development. But it's all based on this massive misconception, which is that we'd be happier if we had money. And there's an evolutionary. I'm quite sure that there's an evolutionary basis for that. Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, so I was wondering. It seems at the end of the talk you say, well, happiness doesn't matter so much, right? So I wonder for you then, with the research you do, so it's like, why are you doing the research? And who gives you money to do this? If it's a public university, because I assume that people do not really want to hear you say precisely this, especially in terms of policy issues, right? So what do you think?
Why people pay me to do this? I have no idea. I'm not going to ask.
No, but there is something strange going on you've come here, you've given a talk on happiness, and then we say, well, happiness doesn't really matter. But at the same time, different supranational organizations, you know, the UN and whatnot, the Human Development Index and whatnot, they're all heavily invested in promoting that happiness matters. Corporations make people do all kinds of stuff. All kinds of things you have to do to show that you're happy. But you're saying that it doesn't really matter. So the question is, I mean, do you get funds for this from the university? For example, because in a way, even the university really wants you to be putting it out there. You know what I'm like to say? It's like, it's sort of counterintuitive, what you're doing. I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy this, but there's something strange about it. Like, why do you why do you fly here to tell people that happiness doesn't matter?
Now, I hope you'll never meet my university administration. But so just to clarify, so I did say that happiness is not as important as many people think. And the point I was making there was that, you know, so many of the people who contribute to the science of happiness will tell you that happiness is the one thing that matters, and it's the one thing we should try to promote through our economic and health policies and so on. And what I was saying was that I think that would be a mistake. Like if you try to do health policy based on these numbers, you end up with really warped suggestions that you would not want to endorse. But I did not quite say that happiness doesn't matter. It matters less than some people think. To the extent that it matters, it's not because well-being is happiness or because there's a tight, necessary conceptual connection. It matters because of something else. So for example, if what well-being is like having your desires fulfilled, then happiness matters to the extent that we want to be happy. And it's true that we want to be happy, right? Augustine wrote about how people want to be happy. If you ask students like worldwide to give a list of things that they want to accomplish in life, like happiness is one of those things that pop up. So people do want to be happy. And to the extent that they do want to be happy and to the extent that desires matter, it does matter. So I don't want you to go home thinking, you know, dude said happiness has no importance, right? Because that's not quite what I was saying. But the connection is more tenuous than many people suggest. And you know, if you want to do policy in a way that's sensitive to empirical findings, which I think is a good idea, right? I think policy should be informed by what we know about the world and people and society and so on. But you can't just look at these numbers and say, yeah, let's maximize that. You need to approach these findings with a great deal of skepticism, some humility, and some, you know, philosophical reflection, some like reflection on what's important in life and what makes for a life well lived. And let me just add this in case there's any confusion. Like, you don't have to be a professional philosopher to do philosophy, right? All of us do philosophy in our lives in various ways, and you know, more so during certain periods of our lives than other periods of our lives.
So it's very clear. Have you seen any of the World Happiness Reports? I don't know if everyone here knows. Every year there's something called the World Happiness Reports issued. What do you think of those?
I think they're wonderful sort of exercises in statistical data gathering. But the philosophical reflection in there is often sort of extremely minimal, which is why I'm so glad to be here with, you know, you guys, because there's an opportunity to encourage this sort of conversation about, like, is this what matters? So suppose we agree that money and like material goods are not the only things that matter. Like, what are the other things that matter, right? That's a good, important question. And it's not a question that we want to leave to professional economists, right? It's not a question we want to leave to professional politicians. And frankly, you shouldn't leave it to professional philosophers either, right? Because everyone's affected by these policies. And yeah, thank you though.
I'm just listening to your talk, and what I find interesting is what drives the pressure for us to be happy. Because it wasn't that long ago in history where it was socially unacceptable to say I'm happy, you know, how are you doing? Like, I can't go to work and when someone says, how are you? And I say, I'm actually miserable, thanks for asking. And actually I find it socially awkward to be honest about happiness. So how, like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's clear that ideas about the importance of happiness are like historically contingent. So there's an historian called Peter Stearns who's written about this to some extent, where he argues that when it comes to kids in particular, like this idea that parents are responsible for like their kids' happiness is extremely recent. in historical perspective. Like for almost all of humankind, the goal was to keep your kids alive, basically, so that they could provide for you in old age. Like this idea that we're somehow responsible for their happiness is extremely recent. And it's not, it's a good thing if kids are happy, right? Don't go home saying I said, kids shouldn't be happy or anything. But, people make these extraordinary sacrifices to make their kids happy, even though like the sacrifices may or may not translate into any additional happiness among the kids, and although it might come at great cost to the parents. And something similar might be true in our lives as adults, right? Where your point about happiness being a positional good, right? If we go around with this attitude that happiness is the only thing that counts, and we look around us and we get the idea that everyone's like so happy all the time, it's going to generate a lot of misery, right? And all the other people you're looking at, they might be as miserable as you are, right? Because they see your pictures from your visit to wherever it was. Or, they look at your perfect something or other, or, something else that you do.
There's some notion out there that if you want to really be successful without being happy, like that to me is a very profound question. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be irresponsible for us to think that we're supposed to pursue happiness 100% of the time? It's very unrealistic and very almost irresponsible. I think when we wake up, it would be healthy to think, I may not be happy today, and I'm prepared to accept that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very healthy perspective.
How does that make you less successful?
So,
The anticipation or the constant pursuit of success can be seen almost at times irresponsible, because the reality is we're not supposed to be happy all the time. That's not.
Also, there are many other values that you might want to promote, and so what do you want to accomplish in your life? Maybe you want to make yourself like reasonably happy, but you could also care about things like justice, for example, right? It might be more important for you to pursue a life that leaves the world a slightly more just place than it was when you started, right? Striving for justice or activist activities or whatnot might come at great personal cost in terms of your happiness, but that might still be something you want to do, right? And so there's a sense in which this celebration of individual happiness sort of misses out on like many other things that are worthwhile also, including, other values that we might want to pursue or promote. But yeah, these are great questions to ask.
Just continuing with that question, I think it's clear that in reality, it's not possible that you will be happy all the time. So I think based on that, we should try to think deep by going in finding the purpose of a life while we are there, right? What's the meaning of our life, rather than trying to find out how we can be happy. And if you look at your own study, which says everything, you cannot figure out what you have to do to get happy, right? There's no conclusion. So what's the purpose of all that?
Yeah.
So we have to think deep and to find out why we are here, what's the purpose of our life. This is just a temporary life.
Yeah.
After that. That is where you find whatever you want to have.
So there's a sense in which happiness might be a sort of trap, right? So let's see now, where should I start with this? So there's some suggestion in the literature that trying to make yourself happy is a lot like trying to fall asleep if you're an insomniac. Like if you lay in bed and you try really, really, really hard to fall asleep, right, it's not going to work. The way to fall asleep is to think about something totally different and allow yourself to drift away. And there's some suggestion that if you give people a ton of money and tell them to go off and make themselves happy, what they do with the money is that they use the additional rope they were given to go hang themselves, metaphorically. They might invest in like loads of cocaine or something, which might be good for the moment, but not really have any lasting positive effects at all. Whereas the best thing you can do if you want to make people happy is to tell, or is the suggestion, is to tell people to go worry about somebody else. So like volunteering, for example, is something you do not with the intention of making yourself happy much of the time, but like the intention you have going in is you're going to make somebody else happy, right? A sick child or a blind person who wants to read the news or something. But what happens in the process is that that's a safer way to make yourself happy than trying to make your own happy. And this meshes with like some traditions of Buddhist thought that treats happiness as a sort of trap in much the same way as money is, right? So the idea is that if you set out to do nothing but make boatloads of money, right, you think that's going to make for a good life, but the reality of it is not that rosy, right? The idea there is that the pursuit of happiness is similar to the pursuit of wealth. It's always just out of reach, right? You're never quite going to get to it. You're not going to be as happy or live as good a life as you thought. And the best thing you could do is just stop worrying about it. Try to worry about nothing at all. There are other strands of Buddhism that thinks of happiness very differently, but there are lots of ideas here that have been floating around that seem quite compelling.
No, but that not answer was my question.
Uh-huh.
My question was that why don't you think about life, why we are here, why we try to find our creator and figure it out why he has created us? That's the most important question, rather than finding out how the happiness is. Because if you find that purpose, then everything will start getting to know you. You will getting answer to all your questions like that.
Yeah, so of course, like non-religious person will feel very differently about this from a religious person, but I think everyone should agree that there are more questions to be asked than just like, how do I make myself happy today or in my life, for sure. So, yeah. I'm going to let you. Yeah.
I was wondering, what's your take on the attitude of happiness among Scandinavians? I read that lots of Scandinavians from Sweden, Denmark, Norway are very happy people. If you could compare with people from North America, and since you've been in both places, and what's your take as differences, and if any?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. So Denmark tends to score at the very top of these rankings, right? Finland is up there, and the other Scandinavian countries are quite high. It's hard to tease out what it is. So when you compare happiness in countries, or average happiness in countries, the problem is that there are only so many countries, right? Ordinarily in science, you want boatloads of observations, right? But there's a limited number of countries, and they're more or less the same from one year to another. And then the other problem is that there's so many other things that correlate. So the Nordic countries have, health care for all and childcare and high female labor force participation and high literacy rates and a whole bunch of things that could correlate with the happiness, right? And so it's hard to tease out like which one of all these factors is causally responsible for the high happiness level. There could also be some cultural factors. So I suspect that part of the story here might be the Lutheran heritage. So in the Lutheran tradition, I guess in the Calvinist tradition also, you're not supposed to be complaining, right? It's a character flaw to go around and tell you like what's wrong with life. And so if people ask you how are things, you're supposed to say, yeah, pretty good. And to my mind, that might reduce the number of people who use like the bottom end of this scale, which would push the average numbers up. But I'm just guessing here based on my personal experience of this. I can't.
Couldn't be also that you have a country like the United States, which world leader, which is supposed to save the world, and you have Canada, or like British Empire. Also, you have attitude of country, which translates attitude of people, which you basically have bigger goal, and then you have country like a Sweden, which more concerned well-being to some extent.
Yeah, that could be. I don't want to speculate too much, but it's true that, another thing is that people have very different attitudes to happiness across countries when it comes to like how important happiness is. So there's a story about de Gaulle, the French general, then president, being asked if he was a happy man, and apparently he answered, what sort of idiot do you take me for? As though it was an insult, right? And I'm told from friends who come from other countries that in their countries, like people who smile a lot are treated as, imbeciles or something, right? Because if you're like aware of what a shitty place the world is, then you wouldn't be smiling like that. And so those sorts of attitudes might also factor into how you respond to these questions, and then obviously you're going to get different scores. Thank you.
Well, okay.
Look, I was surprised that Norway wasn't higher on your, because on a few years ago we did a long visit, and one of the things that struck me was in Norway, a CEO of a company cannot make more than 30 times what the average worker makes. And there was, I was in various things saying that this was one of the factors that helped make Norway life happier in Norway than many other countries. And I was sort of surprised that it wasn't enough higher than the US in your chart. But anyway, do you?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. The numbers bounce around a bit from one year to another, right? So there's some stochastic element. And yeah, I don't know.
So I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a second. Career jobs factor fairly high in measurements of well-being that I've seen. We're coming up on a massive change between AI, automation, that sort of thing, potentially seeing hundreds of thousands of people going out of work, work not meaning anything, as it has for thousands of years. What are we? I mean, where are people? What is life going to look like under those sort of circumstances when you push out one of the major tentpoles of well-being?
Yeah. So I'll say for some, maybe I haven't thought as much about this as you have, but I'm not that worried about automation. So I think about, some time back during the era of like kings and whatever, there'd be men whose job was to open the door when the king arrived and then close the door afterwards. Like that job, that profession is entirely gone, right, effectively, except for ceremonial purposes. Now we have these little automated sensors that open the doors when they need to open themselves and whatever. And you could see somebody lamenting the fact that this entire profession is going away, and the hundreds of years of professional pride will disappear and so on. But you could also say to yourself like, well, good, right? There are better things for those people to do than standing there and open doors and whatever. And so somehow I think people will find other things to do that are more meaningful than the jobs that were replaced by automation. I know this is not like an iron law or something, and I think for many people it's going to be a difficult transition. But the challenge is going to be to find something else that you can do that's meaningful, that's not the sort of job that you did previously. And it's not like there's ever going to be a shortage of things to do, right? If you don't open doors for a living, maybe you can be an artist or write a novel or, perform music or do something that's not just like enjoyable, but the sort of thing that realizes your potential and so on. That's even better for you than the other.
Even between taxi drivers, bus drivers, and truck drivers, we're talking about 100,000, 200,000 people going out of work pretty quickly, and not necessarily the sorts of positions where those folks will necessarily become very close.
Right. And it's particularly hard for people in like the 50 to 60 bracket or something, right, where they're too young to retire immediately, but a little too old to go back to college and learn to code or whatever, And so I don't mean to suggest that any transition would be painless. But economists have talked about this for, the longest time, right? For I assume as long as economics has existed, like the fact that, as we get richer and richer, we don't actually have to work as many hours as we have historically in order to like survive and live better lives. And one thing that might happen is that we realize that as we become richer and richer, on the average, right? Not like everyone is rich, but on the average, we're meeting more and more of our basic, fundamental needs, and that means we can spend our time on things that are more meaningful to us than the other activities were. But yeah, I should probably think more about this.
Okay, so this is the end of our session.
Right.
Thank you again, everybody, for coming. And I'd like you to join me finally in thanking our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That's fun.